Hi, welcome to Church for Skeptics. G.K. Chesterton, a great thinker of a few years ago, said that he became a Christian after reading The Atheists. I can understand why. I try to read as many books by atheists as I can. I'm sure I haven't read all of them. Most of them make the same case over and over. Bertrand Russell, a famous atheist of yesteryear as well, made this statement, and this is the point that I want to make throughout this season. Bertrand Russell said, "No one could believe in God after being at the bed of a dying child." Well, of course, that's not really true, because many people believe in God after being at the bed of a dying child. Sad to say, oftentimes their own child. But my point is this: what does Bertrand Russell have to offer in place of God? If you can't believe in God at such a heartache as that, what's your alternative? What's atheism's offer in place of faith in God? Really, all an atheist can say is, well, it's really bad luck and there is no hope. And that's exactly what Bertrand Russell said at another time. He said the only way we can build our lives is on the firm foundation of total despair. That's the answer of atheism. And the point of this session, or this season and this session, is that atheism leads to absurdities. That was my rejection of my own atheism, was that it just leads to absurdities. And then, now get that, please understand what I'm trying to say here. Atheism leads us to the point of absurdity and then tries to borrow against those absurdities from the theistic worldview just to argue against theism. And that's what we've tried to show this season. Atheism ridicules belief in God as the creator of the universe and has literally nothing to replace him. And I mean that literally nothing. It's amazing. There's a little similarity between my beliefs and the belief of an atheist. I say the universe came from nothing physically, and they just say the universe came from nothing. Well, of course, that's impossible, so there has to be something other than nothing. I say God. What do they say? They stick with nothing. Absurd. And then add to that, I'm reviewing a little bit from prior programs, any naturalistic explanation for the existence of nature is the epitome of begging the question, otherwise known as circular reasoning. You can't explain the thing by using the very thing you are trying to explain it. Maybe that doesn't make sense, but that's a definition of circular reasoning. You can't explain nature by nature if you're trying to explain nature in the first place. But perhaps the most important thing on the list of absurdities that atheism presents us with is that atheism has no answer for the reality of right and wrong. That is to say, for morality. And I'm going to title this program at the beginning, because I'll say it often during the program. The title of this program is Who Says? Something I heard on the playground when I was in the first grade, and I'll tell you about that in a minute. Thanks for watching. It's interesting that, to me, I just was thinking this earlier, that naturalism, and that's the belief that nature is all that exists, there's nothing else but the universe. Naturalism cannot account for nature, which is physical, of course, but it also cannot account for anything that is not natural. Wow, that's a dilemma if you're a naturalist, i.e. atheist, and they kind of have to go together, I think. But I hope you understand what I'm saying here. Naturalism can't account for itself, can't account for nature. That's circular, but it also can't account for anything that's supernatural or not natural, immaterial. So we have to go to the metaphysical for any kind of reasonable explanation. But the pit that naturalism digs for itself, which leads to the absurdities I'm talking about, is that they cannot explain anything outside of the material universe. They can't explain anything without using the material universe. That's all they've got to draw from in their explanations. So hopefully it's not hard to see at all that any attempt to explain the existence of right and wrong as a reality, that is morality, in naturalistic terms accomplishes nothing except explaining morality into oblivion. And here again, it replaces morality, tries to, with either the survival of biology or the relativism, which is just personal opinion, of sociology. The word I'm looking for here is reductionism, and what it has to do is reduce the wonder, the majesty, the holiness of right and wrong, of morality. It reduces it to material. And by reducing it to material matter, it goes away. It doesn't even exist. It explains it away, is what it does. In either case, you've either got, if morality is just physical, it's also just determined what we will do, not whether we should or shouldn't, but whatever we do is determined by a blind process of nature. Or if you want to try to explain it in terms of culture, then it reduces it to what we individuals like to call civilization. I think it was Mahatma Gandhi, popped in my head. Somebody asked him what he thought of Western civilization. Gandhi said, "I think it would be a good idea." So that's the history of the human race and another subject. When I go to Europe, I often ask people, I try to just ask a lot of questions. I ask people how they reconcile the opposing views of universal human rights against their other pet view of subjective morality. That is, where everyone determines for themselves what ought and ought not to be. So if you have on the one hand, everybody gets to choose for themselves what's right and wrong, and on the other hand, you have this universal human rights, how do you reconcile those? Because they're logically totally opposed. And it's amazing, that has been the starting point for some of the most interesting and productive conversations I've ever had. Maybe there's just a little more openness there and willingness to discuss these things. So I'm going to tell you one illustration here. I remember my first fight. I haven't gotten in a lot of fights. I guess I could say I'm a lover, not a fighter, but I'm not sure that would be accurate either. So my first fight was in the first grade. Now you have to understand this. I'm going to date myself here. I went to the last one-room schoolhouse in the state of Massachusetts in the first grade. It was actually in Newburyport, Massachusetts, just outside of Boston. And this fight was on the playground, and it was on the issue of justice because it was my turn on the swing. And this bully, it was in the first grade. We actually had first, second, and third grade in the one room. But the bully of the third grade was on the swing and wouldn't give it up. And so somebody said, it wasn't actually me that said this, somebody said, "Hey, it's my turn." And here's what the bully said. This goes back a long way, by the way. He said, "Who says?" And of course then ensued a fight in which I participated on the side of justice. We all got in trouble because the ultimate justice, the teacher, came and put an end to that, and nobody got on the swing, I think. But my point is this: nothing much changes as we grow up. The question still is, when you're talking about right and wrong, the existence of morality, the question still is, who says? Grown-up, educated people don't usually say that. They say things like, "You have no right to enforce your morality on me." That's just a grown-up way of saying "who says?" Which means, think about what I'm saying here. So I make a statement, they say, "You have no right to enforce your morality on me," which means that they assume the right to make a moral judgment against what I'm saying, that they are exercising and passing judgment on my comment, while at the same time denying me the right to pass judgment on them. Now, we really don't live that way. People make judgments all the time, and you can be judgmental, and that's wrong. Um, the scripture says, judge not that you be not judged. What it's really saying is you judge yourself first, and maybe you'll see clearly to help somebody else rather than judge them. But the point is, when somebody says you have no right to enforce your morality on me, what they're saying is they have a right to make a moral judgment, but I don't, which is the epitome, again, of a double standard. But the real point here is that both disagreeing parties, whether it's on the playground and whose turn it is, or in the adult world, where we try to use bigger words and loftier language, we are inevitably both pointing to a standard that is outside of either of them. If somebody says to me, you have no right to, who says? And they don't mean to say, I don't think you have a right. They mean to, they're expecting me to acknowledge that they're right in their moral judgment, that I have no right to judge them. And in a sense, they are. But it's we're both appealing to a higher level of who says, a higher level of moral standard that is outside of us. It's not, when we answer the question, who says, we're not the ones who get that right. We're not the ones who make that call. Well, okay, enter the sociologist, who's going to say right and wrong, human rights and so forth are not determined by individuals then, but they're determined by various cultures. And certainly it's true that various cultures have a standard by which they operate and by which they sometimes agree what ought and ought not to be done. But the problem is exactly the same. I hope you can see this. I hope you can see easily that it means what they're saying is morality is determined by majority rule. So then morality is the result of democracy in some cultures, or maybe dictatorship in other cultures. Take your pick. But the problem's the same. If the majority, now think about what I'm saying here, and I'll pause after this. If the majority determine morality, then to whom does the minority appeal when the majority is trampling on their rights? To whom does the individual in that culture appeal when the majority is trampling on their rights and calling it the right thing to do? Thus again, here's the course of human history. Here's another question. If there is no objective, and by objective I mean right or wrong, no matter who says what, whether I like it or not, if there's no objective standard beyond or above humanity, which is the same as saying above culture, to determine or discover, is a better word, right and wrong, what happens when a culture embraces a morality of conquest? And that's exactly been the history of the world. We just kind of wait between wars. I was a history major. We're waiting between wars always in the history of the human race. Sad, tragic. And it's always based on some culture's morality of conquest. We're better than you, so we ought to conquer your country. So if morality is just individual, then it's might makes right. If morality is cultural, in the end, that's going to turn out exactly the same way on a broader scale. It's who gets the swing, or who gets the country, who gets the land. When the Nazis were purifying the world of inferior races, one of the survivors in Poland, actually the second country, I guess you could say, that the Nazis invaded after Czechoslovakia, but one of the survivors, and they began the ethnic cleansing right away, but one of the survivors of that recorded or recounted a group of Hasidic Jews who were being forced to dig their own graves, with the Nazi guards watching them with submachine guns. And of course, after they would dig their graves, they would gun them down and push them into the graves they had dug for themselves. One old Hasidic Jew looked at his tormentor, his executioner, and said, God is watching. God sees what you are doing. Of course, at which point he was gunned down and shoved into the grave that he had dug for himself. David Berlinski a brilliant, brilliant thinker who is himself not a believer. I hope he becomes a believer. He's so close, it seems to me, but he has certainly read the mail of the new atheists. David Berlinski says, the common belief among every official murderer, not everyone, I guess you could say, there's some religious murderers in the 20th century, but the common belief among a great majority of official government-sponsored murderers in the 20th century, whether you're talking about Stalin or Hitler or Pol Pot or whoever, the common belief of them and their evil minions was the belief that indeed God is not watching. And then David Berlinski says this, he says, that is, after all, isn't it, the definition of a secular society? Yes, it is. The word secular means of this world only. There are no religious or spiritual implications involved. Secular humanism, by the way, is the fastest rising worldview in the United States. Probably with the atheism that goes along with it often, but not always. But secular humanism is the fastest rising worldview. C.S. Lewis, in his book, The Abolition of Man, which I highly, highly recommend, makes this point. Until the modern age, really, and I would go back a little further maybe than him, until after the Age of Reason, so-called, in the 18th century, virtually every culture, every society had a moral standard. And there's many differences, of course, between the moral standards of those cultures, and I'm not trying to make a point about that. I'm trying to make a bigger point. But the reason they had these standards, that they felt that everybody, here's the difference, they felt that everybody was obligated to their moral standard because they did not believe it originated with them. They would have laughed at the idea of individual morality. They would have laughed at the idea of cultural morality. Now, different cultures call this rightness, this oughtness, this moral code, different things. And I love what Lewis does in his book, The Abolition of Man. For the Jews, it was the law, of course. For the Chinese, it was the Tao, which means the way. And I've come to love that word and use that word, but the point is not that there were differences, and by the way, there were a lot more similarities than differences, and still are. There's a lot more similarities than differences between the moral code that I believe in and the secular humanist. But it's because God's hardwired it into us. It's part of what being human is. And that's the point, that the moral law is binding and obligatory precisely because it does not originate with nature or individuals or groups of individuals, i.e. cultures. So please don't misunderstand me here. I'm not trying to say that every culture had exactly the same view on what the Tao is, the way things are supposed to be, or especially I'm not saying that they did not impose their own selfish ambitions on that Tao. Certainly that's exactly what they did. Crusades, perfect example. Here's a great example of people who said they were Christians imposing their own selfish ambitions on what they said was the absolute objective moral law of God and using that to do harm to other people. But I don't think there's anybody, even an atheist, who would not agree that they were misusing and abusing the teachings of Christ. Here's another great example that just popped in my head. This is exactly what Jesus said the Pharisees were doing. Think about it. He's saying that the reason he condemned the Pharisees was that they were adding their own opinions and their own traditions and adding burdens on the people that were under their authority, but they were adding those things to the moral law of God, the true Tao, and they were making them equal. And that's why Jesus condemned them. So I just want you to understand what the point we're making here. Big point is this: if the moral law does not exist as part of the nature of an absolute, perfectly moral God, then it is meaningless, it's non-existent. We've explained it away by explaining it as biology or sociology, or any time you get relativism, and this is one of the points I'll make as we close, Anytime you try to make morality relative, you make it meaningless. And that's what I want to show. So stay with us as we finish up here. The current postmodern view that there is no higher law, I think, is a reaction to the abuses that we were just talking about, how cultures abuse and impose their own will on what they know to be the moral law of God. I'll give you an example. Before the French Revolution, the church actually did, and wrongly so, enable the royalty and the aristocracy of France to completely abuse the rights of the people of France. So it's not surprising that the church was seen as the enemy of freedom, and the revolutionaries went to the Notre Dame Cathedral and tore down the religious statues and put up a statue to the goddess of reason. So we don't need, we've basically thrown out the baby with the bathwater because of the abuses of the baby. And the result, here's what I want you to see, the result was exactly the same. They swapped the abuses of one group of people for the abuses of another group of people who were calling the shots. In the famous words of Pete Townsend, meet the new boss, same as the old boss. And that's why I'm saying atheism leads to absurdities, and then to try to they're going to borrow against those by stealing from the Christian worldview to do it. Let me relate a more emotional and heartbreaking story to you. I heard Ravi Zacharias talk about this. He was on a plane. Sitting next to him, as it turned out, was a woman who was involved in the rescue of people who were involved in sex trafficking, who were the victims of sex trafficking. And they had just returned from the same city. He had been speaking there, and as he asked this lady, how did it go? Were you successful? And she related to him the heartbreaking story that the very night before, now I want you to think about this, she had rescued an 18-month-old baby from the arms of a man who was abusing that baby and molesting her. Ravi Zacharias said he was relating that incident, which I mean, if you don't know in the deepest part of you that that is evil at its utmost, I don't know what to do with you. But Ravi Zacharias was relating that story in a question and answer session at a university. He had one young man stand up in response, and in the conversation, Ravi related that story. And here's what the young man said. He was an atheist now, so he's trying to stick to his guns. He's trying to be consistent. He's trying to say there is no ultimate morality, there is no objective right and wrong. And he says, and it's really important that you understand what he says. He said, I don't like what happened, but I really cannot say that it was evil. Isn't there something in you that wants to cry out, why in the world not? Why can you not say that's evil? Well, I'll tell you why I can't. Because he's dug a deep hole for himself in denying the existence of God. In denying the existence of God, you have to also deny the existence of objective morality, of human value. So he can't say that it's evil, because if he posits evil, he has to also posit there's a good. There is a Tao. There is a way things ought to be. But if there is a way things ought to be, that means there has to be a moral law. And if there is a moral law, there has to be a moral lawgiver. And even, listen to this, even at the expense, as C.S. Lewis would say, of the abolition of man, even at the expense of what it means to be a human being made in the image of God, they cannot go that direction. And so they've set about trying to establish some sort of standard of right and wrong and keep God out of the picture at all costs. I was speaking once at a Unitarian Universalist fellowship, and there was an archaeologist there who was asking questions, and so we're talking about this very point of morality, and I said, you know, every year I go out in my backyard and spread amdro across my yard to kill as many fire ants as I can, because I have grandchildren. They go out there, and when they're little, of course, they don't know enough to run. They just get covered up in fire ants. So I asked, here's my question to you. Is what I'm doing in my backyard to those fire ants any different? I'm killing millions, let's say. Is that any different than the Holocaust? Here again, she dug her heels in intellectually, and she said, no, there's no difference. Well, why does she have to say that? Because she's a naturalist. And humans have no more value. We may be a more highly evolved species, but that's to no credit and no value of our own. And so there's no real difference. We're just one species, the fire ants are another, and so there's no real difference. Now, to her credit, it bothered her later that she said that, and she has since made a major turn in her life. But I want to close with this idea. I put these people who want to talk about morality in two different groups. You have the honest group, which I call the nihilists, and then you have the dishonest group who want to make a case against Christianity by stealing from it, and I call them the secular humanists. So as we close, I want to make a distinction between those two. In the first group, I'll give you two examples. One is the famous Friedrich Nietzsche, German philosopher. And the reason I call them consistent is because they're willing to bite the capsule. They're just willing to take the whole pill. If there is no God, there is no morality, there is no right and wrong. And that's exactly what Friedrich Nietzsche said. As a matter of fact, he said morality stands and falls with the Christian faith. If the Christian faith is not true, God is dead, there is no right and wrong. And Nietzsche predicted that the only way to get any kind of meaning out of life was for some, what he called the Übermann, Hitler, to enforce his goals for life, his projects on the lives of others, and hence they would have some meaningless meaning for their life. And that's exactly what happened. Hitler was Nietzsche's perhaps greatest student. He gave Mussolini a copy of Nietzsche's works in Italian. The other nihilist that I want to talk about is Ayn Rand. And the reason I want to talk about her briefly is because this is what it's like today. Ayn Rand is an egoist. And Ayn Rand wants to make the point that the only moral standard is what pleases me, because I'm going to live for 70 or 80 years, I'm going to be gone in oblivion, and it's just, she would actually say, it's morally, intellectually stupid for me to do anything other than what pleases me. Now, I may have to be smart about it and make some deals along the way, but there is no treachery too low, no selfish interest too great, and no act too vile so as not to be justified by my own pleasure. Those are the nihilists, the ones who bite the bullet. Now, go back to the atheist's answer to Snake Alley. Remember what he said? He said, I don't like it, but I can't say that it's evil. That's the second group, the secular humanists. They can't say something's right or wrong, but they want to get us all to agree to be nice to each other because we survive better that way. And indeed, we do. But if we have no value, no meaning, no purpose, no Tao, what is the point of our survival anyway? Thank you so much for watching. We'll probably come back and visit this again on Church for Skeptics.